Okay, so let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
I want you to just close your eyes for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine you are roughly 15 years old.
Okay.
You're standing in the middle of the Arabian desert. The heat is just oppressive. Sand is everywhere. And you're witnessing the birth of a civilization that's going to change, well, the trajectory of the entire world.
And you're just a kid.
You're just a kid, too young to even hold a spear in the first major battle. But you end up carrying a sword in 15 subsequent wars.
Talk about a baptism by fire.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. You see the death of the prophet, the rise of the caliphs, and then just the absolute chaos of the civil wars that tear your community apart.
And somehow you survive it all.
You survive all of that. You live to be an old man, blind, sitting in a city called Kufa, reciting memories that will eventually form the laws binding billions of people centuries later.
It's a sweeping image, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the figure at the center of that whole storm is Al-Bara ibn Azib.
Al-Bara ibn Azib. Now, to a lot of people, even people who follow history closely, he might just be a name, in the footnotes of a hadith collection.
Narrated by Al-Bari.
Right. But when you really dig into the sources, and we have a massive stack today, from classical biographies to modern secular critiques, he turns into this fascinating bridge figure.
That's a perfect term for him, a bridge.
Yeah.
He connects the prophet's lifetime, that explosive era of the early conquest, and then the trauma of the first fitna, the civil war. He spans eras that feel like they should be centuries apart.
But for him, it was just one life. And the stats on him are pretty wild. He narrated approximately 305 hadiths.
Mm-hmm.
He died around 690 CE, so that's 72 AH, which makes him one of the last living links to that early period. But here's the mystery that caught my eye immediately.
The missing data.
The missing data. For a guy who talks so much, we know almost nothing about him.
Strange, isn't it?
It is. We know he was from the Banu Aus tribe, the Ansar. We know his military resume. But his wives, children, slaves,
Yeah.
It's a blank page.
Which is actually quite typical for the classical biographical dictionaries, the Tabaqat. They were hyper-focused on religious and military output.
The public resume, so to speak.
Exactly. Domestic details were often seen as irrelevant unless they, impacted a legal ruling.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at Al-Bara, the mission for this deep dive has to be to look past that blank page.
Right.
We need to figure out how reliable is the memory of a teenager recorded decades later? And how do we reconcile a man who is claimed as a hero by Sunnis, a conflicted partisan by Shias, and, well, a source of folklore by skeptics?
That is the puzzle. So let's jump into that first piece, the young witness. Al-Bara was young, like really young.
Correct. Sources estimate he was around 13 to 15 years old when the prophet passed away.
So young.
He was actually turned away from the Battle of Badr, the first major battle, because he was considered a child. Literally too small to march in the line.
Wow.
But he essentially grew up on the battlefield after that. He was in Uhud, Khandak, Khaybar.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. We rely on this guy for 305 narrations. Many of them are, complex legal rulings or heavy theological descriptions. From a modern perspective, isn't that kind of wild? That laws binding us today come from the memories of a 15-year-old.
This is where we hit the child companion debate. It's a massive topic. Traditional scholars will argue that in 7th century Arabia, a 15-year-old was effectively an adult.
Okay.
And they point to the oral culture defense, that this society was trained from childhood for rigorous memorization. These weren't just casual memories, they were repeated teachings ingrained through practice.
But the sources also brought up this concept called the telescope effect. Can you break that down? Because that sounds like something from a physics textbook, not history.
It's a concept from cognitive science, but it applies perfectly here. The idea is that when you interview someone in their 70s, and remember, Al-Bara lived to be an elderly, blind man about events from their teenage years, memory doesn't work like a video recording. It compresses.
Compresses how?
Events that happened years apart might merge into one story. Details from different battles might bleed together.
Okay. Like when you ask your grandfather about high school,
Yeah.
and he mixes up his sophomore and senior year teachers.
Precisely. The telescope just collapses the distance between events. So 50 years later, he might be narrating a legal ruling with total confidence, but the context, the when and the why, could be fuzzy.
So skeptics would argue that what we're getting is a reconstruction, memory shaped by all the years in between. And looking at the data, the stats actually kind of back this up a bit. You mentioned 305 hadiths.
Right.
Well, only a fraction of those are considered sahih, or authentic, in the major collections like Bukhari or Muslim. Bukhari only took about 50 of them.
A small fraction.
Yeah. Even classical critics labeled some of his reports as Munkar rejected or odd. So even the traditionalists had filters. They knew that not every word coming from an old man's memory was guaranteed to be perfect.
That's a crucial point. The traditional scholars weren't naive. They cross-referenced. If al-Bara was the only one saying something and sounded strange, they flagged it.
So they respected him, but verified the data.
They respected him, but they verified. Which is good practice for anyone, really.
True. But let's move to the drama, the politics. Because al-Bara wasn't just sitting in a mosque. He was a governor, a soldier, and he lived through the First Civil War.
This is the segment we call the political tightrope. And al-Bara is a fascinating case study in loyalty because he's claimed by opposing sides.
It's like two different people are looking at the same portrait and seeing different faces.
Exactly. So you have the Sunni view and you have the Shia view.
Okay, let's break them down.
If you look through the Shia lens, al-Bara is essentially a proto-Shia figure. He narrated the famous hadith of Ghadir Khumm, which is the text Shias use to affirm Ali's status as the successor.
And the sources say he was one of the few who rushed to inform the Prophet's family, the Banu Hashim, about that secret meeting at Saqifa.
The one where Abu Bakr was chosen as caliph?
Right.
Some accounts even say he initially refused to pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr. So, in the Shia narrative, he starts off as this loyalist to Ali. But then there's a twist.
The tragic prophecy. I read this and I got chills.
It's a heavy story. Shia sources mention that Imam Ali allegedly told al-Bara that his son, Husayn, would be martyred in the future. And here's the kicker.
What?
Ali told him that al-Bara would be alive when it happened, but he would fail to help him.
And did that happen?
According to the narrative, yes.
Yeah.
Al-Bara lived long enough to see the tensions rising before the tragedy of Karbala. And he expressed this deep regret later in life, realizing he'd survived to see the prophecy come true, but wasn't there to stop it.
Wow.
So Shias view him as this conflicted partisan, someone who knew the truth, but maybe lacked the political will or the opportunity to act on it when it really mattered.
That is tragic. Okay, so contrast that with the Sunni lens. To them, he's dika, trustworthy, neutral.
Exactly. For Sunnis, his service is proof of his adaptability and neutrality. He served as the governor of Al-Ray, that's in Persia, under Caliph Uthman.
Which proves he wasn't purely anti-establishment. He was willing to govern for the state.
Right. And yes, he fought alongside Ali at the battles of Jamal and Siffin. But Sunnis view that as ijtihad.
Independent judgment.
Independent judgment between righteous companions, not rebellion.
But there's a skeptical take here too, right? The accusation of political opportunism.
It's the cynical but historically grounded question. Did al-Bara navigate these dangerous waters by telling people what they wanted to hear? He goes from being a governor for Uthman to a soldier for Ali, and then he survives into the Umayyad era.
As an elder in Kufa. And the Umayyads were not exactly known for being kind to Ali's supporters.
Not at all. So, did he survive by narrating things that were safe? Or did he narrate pro-Ali hadiths like Ghadir Khumm to keep the memory of Ali alive in an era where the Umayyads were actively trying to erase it?
That's the critical synthesis. It's just so hard to be a neutral narrator when history is being written by the victors.
And then there's another layer of confusion.
What's that?
Historians point out he is often confused with another companion, al-Bara ibn Malik.
Oh, right. Al-Bara ibn Malik was a fierce warrior, a very different temperament, so some of the conquest narratives might not even be our Al-Bara.
It's a historical identity crisis. It's messy.
History's messy. But let's switch gears to something a little darker. We have to talk about the grave.
Ah, yes. Adhab al-Qabr, the punishment of the grave.
Al-Bara's is the source for some of the most graphic, terrifying descriptions of what happens after we die. We're talking about angels Munkar and Nakir, an iron hammer.
And ribs being crushed until they interlock.
I mean, it is vivid imagery. It's almost gothic horror before the genre even existed.
And this is where we see a major clash between sort of the theological defense and the materialist critique.
The skeptics and ex-Muslim historians in our sources really hammer pun intended on this point. They argue this sounds exactly like folklore.
Yes, the argument is cultural syncretism. They suggest these stories reflect pre-Islamic Arabian beliefs or maybe Near Eastern myths about the underworld rather than divine revelation.
And that it serves a sociological function.
Social control.
Social control.
Think about it. If you want to ensure people follow the rules, especially in a society without a modern police force or a surveillance state. What works better than fear?
Right.
If you terrify people, especially children, with stories of iron hammers waiting for them in the dark if they sin, you induce obedience. It's a very effective psychological tool.
And there's the empirical problem, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we can exhume bodies. We don't see crushed ribs.
That is the materialist objection. If the text says the ribs interlock, and we open the grave and the skeleton is intact,
Then what?
isn't the text just falsified?
So how do traditionalists respond to that? Because that seems like a pretty direct contradiction.
They shift the domain. They argue these are metaphysical realities. It's the world of the Barzak,
So what's happening to the soul?
to the soul, or to a spiritual body, not the biological matter that we can touch and measure. They would say it's unfalsifiable because you're using physical tools to measure a spiritual event. You can't weigh a soul on a scale.
So it's a clash of worldviews. But Al-Barr's legacy isn't just ghost stories. He also laid down some specific legal rulings that are offense. Well, they're tricky for modern listeners to wrap their heads around.
This is where the rubber meets the road. We can talk about spirituality all day, but Al-Barra narrated laws that involve life and death.
Let's look at case study A, the stepmother execution. This one just blew my mind. Al-Barra narrated that the Prophet sent him, personally, to execute a man who had married his father's wife
And to confiscate as well.
and confiscate his wealth.
This is a heavy narration. To give some context, the Quran explicitly prohibits marrying your father's wife, but it doesn't specify the death penalty for it in the text.
So Al-Barra is providing this supplementary punishment that's far more severe than what's in the Quran itself.
Exactly, and the confiscation of wealth. Critics in our sources argue this looks suspicious.
Is this state enrichment? Is there a financial motive disguised as piety?
That's the critical historical view. They argue this reflects the harsh tribal violence of 7th century Arabia being sort of projected back onto the Prophet. It looks like a way for the early state to seize assets.
But traditionalists would see it as sunnah.
Right, the Prophet exercising his authority to set a severe deterrent for a particularly heinous form of incest.
But it creates this tension. We have this holy warrior image of Al-Barra literally riding out to behead a man, which clashes so hard with modern humanitarian norms.
It forces you, the listener, to grapple with history. Is Al-Barra a timeless moral exemplar, or a man of his time enforcing the brutal norms of his era?
And then on the flip side, we have something that just seems totally random. Case study B, the camel meat voodoo.
Yes, this is a famous one in legal circles.
Al-Barra narrated that eating camel meat breaks your ritual purity, but eating sheep meat doesn't.
Laugh slightly.
Yes.
Why? I mean, what is the logic there? Is camel meat spiritually different from sheep meat? That is the big question. Even the classical legal schools fought over this. The Hanafis and Shafis basically said, this doesn't make logical sense, or it must be abrogated. It just seems arbitrary.
Critics see this as ritualism gone wrong, or maybe just a young man misunderstanding a specific context.
Exactly. Imagine this scenario. Perhaps the Prophet told someone to wash after eating camel meat because that specific camel was greasy or stinky, or they had wiped their hands on their clothes.
Okay, I see.
And Al-Barra, watching as a teenager, turned that specific one-time moment into a universal law for all time.
It highlights the danger of taking these isolated snippets of memory and turning them into eternal legislation, which brings us to the biggest problem of all.
The broken telephone of history.
The transmission gap. We have to remember, Al-Barra dies around 690 CE. The major written collections, Bukhari, Muslim, they aren't compiled until the mid-800s. That is a massive gap.
150 to 200 years.
That's a long time.
Yep.
If I played a game of telephone for 2 hours, the message would be garbled. Imagine 2 centuries.
And Al-Barra's narrations often funnel through specific students, like a man named Abu Ishaq al-Sabi. This is what historians call a bottleneck.
A bottleneck.
Yeah. If Abu Ishaq makes a mistake, or if he has a political bias, the entire memory of Al-Barra is tainted because he's the primary channel it flows through.
So the expert verdict, can we verify any of it?
Well, if you take the skeptical view, it's almost impossible to separate Al-Barra's actual words from the storytellers, the Qasas, who might have used his name decades later to give their stories authority.
Well, Al-Barra said just becomes a stamp of approval.
Exactly. But the traditional view relies on the isnad, the chain of transmission.
They would say the system works.
They'd say the system is rigorous, they cross-reference, and the fact that critics labeled some of his hadiths as weak proves the system does work. It filters out the noise, They trust the process.
So what does this all mean? When we look at Al-Bara ibn Azib, we aren't just looking at a man, we're looking at a mirror.
That is the perfect summary. Al-Bara is a microcosm of early Islam. He embodies the violence, the politics, the deep spirituality, and frankly, the confusion.
If you're a Sunni, you look at him and you see a saint, a loyal companion, who bridged the gap between the Prophet and the Caliphate.
If you're a Shia, you see a conflicted partisan, a man who knew the truth about Ali, but got caught in the machinery of the state and ended his life in regret.
And if you're a skeptic, you see a source of folklore. A teenager whose memories were reshaped by trauma and old age used to justify laws he might not have even understood.
He reflects the viewer's bias perfectly. You find what you're looking for in him.
So here's my final thought for you to chew on. We talked about the telescope effect. We talked about Al-Bara being an old blind man in Kufa decades after the Prophet was gone, living through civil wars that shattered his community.
A deeply traumatic time.
If his memory was shaped by that trauma and by the nostalgia of an old man, are we reading the Prophet's actual words, or are we reading the nostalgia of an old warrior trying to recapture a lost utopia that never truly existed?
That is the question that haunts every page of history.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you on the next one.